Hello and welcome to my very first voiced video ever. I do apologize right away for my horrible sound editing. Turns out that my mic isn't all that great, the volume changes a lot and I break at weird times. If this gets to be too much for you, there's a written and less babbly guide linked in the description below. I hope you find something useful in my attempt to make a guide. This build is all about buffing and amping the two AoE skills on the Warp Rod, hence I called it the rather pretentious name Rod Amp. Getting Warp Blast and Witchfire to hit as hard as possible is the priority of this build, and we achieve this by stacking multiple cooldown reductions and stacking as many multipliers as possible. There's two slight variants to this build, swapping out armors for more mobility versus survivability. I'll go over these at the end of the video. Starting out with the skill trees, we pick up almost everything in the Art of the Death Cult, or the crit tree. You could skip Red Thirst, as it isn't really working as of this video, but once it is, it's going to be another great damage multiplier and the first of many in this build. You could pick up Berserker's Rage for 1% HP per crit, but this doesn't really seem to work for me, or at least only when I get beneath 50% health. Next up is the movement tree. Everything on the left side is pretty optional, but I find that more movement speed is quite effective, especially when running the warp bound variant. Furthermore, Cardial Overdrive does help you when locked down by enemy Psykers. The right side, however, is mandatory. Here we pick up Cerebral Feedback for cooldown on crit, Psychic Prod decreasing our cooldowns even further, and lastly picking up Quickening is optional again, but for faster clear speeds it's quite valuable. For the last and most powerful of the mandatory skill trees, we fill out everything in the AoE tree. Damage increases and increased area of effect are obviously beneficial, but it's once again the cooldown that we're mostly here for. Eradicated Protocol is the most powerful cooldown reducer that we have, and outside this one melee damage amp, we benefit from everything in the tree. Quick disclaimer, I've tested or received information on a lot of these skills, but some of them I just take at face value, such as 10% warp damage from this tree. We can't talk about this tree without mentioning Optimal Dispersion. Winner of March's most broken skill and overall biggest reason why you're seeing stupid numbers from Psykers. This skill states that you gain 1% damage increase per enemy within the AoE. In reality, this number is probably closer to 50 or 100% per enemy. And on top of that, this also factors in Destructible Environment. The highest crit I've done with this is about 400,000. This is multiple times the health of anything. Having tested this skill in multiple ways, both in single player and multiplayer, and with more ads or less ads, and with and without it, as you see on the video to the left, this is obviously broken, and in my opinion it should simply be disabled until they find a way to fix it. You could opt not to run it. I mean, it wouldn't be that impactful if it was working correctly. It would be something like 10% extra damage on a boss if it had 10 ads around it, right? So running without it would put you way closer to the experience that Neocore wanted you to have. I think that covers it for broken stuff, at least for now. Later on in the video, there's a few other skills that are slightly broken, but nothing close to this. What you do with your remaining points is really up to you. I chose to put the remaining in the range tree. With patch 101, the Psyker weapon skills are counted as a ranged skill again, and you can pick up some additional crit and a further 10% damage multiplier with focused aim. That's all our skill points spent, and we move on to the Psyker powers slotted in both weapon sets. First up, we have Warp Speed. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's another cooldown reduction, it's another 25% damage multiplier, and you should keep this up at all times. It's really easy to notice when this falls off, as your damage just tanks and you can really feel the missing cooldown reduction. Piriform is another straight up damage multiplier. It also has the added benefit of some slight damage reduction, and when you're dealing with multiple swarm variant enemies, it allows you to simply move through them to kill them. In multiplayer or harder content, it might not outright kill them, but as it's considered an AoE, all the hits you get from it will reduce your cooldowns. This will often be enough to bring Witchfire back so that you can use it on the next larger pack. Try to keep this up all the time, but as it has the shortest duration of any of our buffs, it's really annoying to rebuff it every 30 seconds, so having it up for bosses or rebuffing it when you're waiting for a door to open is just fine. Finishing off our offensive buffs, we got what might be the second most broken skill in the Psyker repertoire. Divine Shot amps your first hit on any enemy by 100% or 70% according to the tooltip when you're actually playing the game. This should always be kept up. The ideal time to rebuff this is right after you hit the boss for the first time, you rebuff it again and you get to hit the boss again for another 200% damage. In multiplayer, however, at least graphically, it stacks up to 8 times. I've spoken to a lot of players who play this build or a similar build, and some of them are confirming that it does stack more than just on the buff bar, and others are saying that it does not. I've tried to test it multiple times, and sometimes it seems it does, sometimes it seems it doesn't. In any case, it's still way too overpowered. I would say it needs to be reduced to about 50%. Last but certainly not least, I use precognition. This buff has some rather strange interactions with both its duration and the relic-specific affix on chest armors. I'll go into further detail at the end of the video once I describe the interaction with the armor. On our second set of weapons, we only have 2 buffs. Death Augury allows you to die once and get back to 50 HP. It's not super effective because you really gotta watch out once it's procced. Once the buff is removed from your bars, you have to get far away and rebuff it. I seldom use this, but when I do, it's oftentimes because I only have 1 life left and I really want to complete the mission. Misfortune is really powerful, and with a 1 minute and 30 duration, it's really not hard to keep active for all the bosses who needs it. It's sort of a weird buff, and the way it's worded sounds really weird as well, but essentially it just makes anything that has armor have no armor, and anything that has heavy armor, such as tank, has only half armor or normal armor values. This is only really useful for multiplayer where you're not one-shotting everything, and it also helps you quite a bit on tanks when you're soloing really high content such as 250 plus. And before we proceed to stat allocations, I would really like to stress that it's very important that these 2 buffs are placed in your armor slot and in your belt slot, that is the ones all the way to your right. The reason for this is that those are the only 2 spots that do not reset their cooldown when you switch weapons, meaning you can switch to it immediately, buff both skills and then switch back. Next up are stats. Side focus has no real benefit outside the first milestone, as Warp Heat is a non-issue for this build, and only the 4th milestone and 20 points would gain you a slight benefit. Resilience adds to our defensive capabilities per point, and every milestone until the 5th has a benefit. I would aim to get 20 points here, as defensive stats and movement are all really beneficial to this build. Force grants us a damage increase per point. Even though damage is always helpful, it would be our weakest multiplier, and at a full 25 points, only the crit chance from milestone 4 and the 5% warp damage would benefit us in any way. I would suggest putting your remaining points into this stat once you have filled resilience to 20 points. Moving on to the perks. Anointment is really optional, but as you're running with 3 to 4 buffs most of the time, it does provide another 40% damage multiplier. There are other damage amps, but none come close to this one. Some people have pointed out that retrograde psychic domination would be great and that 100% damage amp would always be active as you have 0 warp heat. However, this is only applied to psychic powers and does not benefit our warp rod weapon skills. The game differentiates pretty harshly between weapon skills and Psyker powers. Force weapon mastery is pretty self-explanatory. Another 150% multiplier with a great uptime really needs no explanation and absolutely must have perk. Lastly, Psychic Boon is near mandatory and makes the build tolerable as you have to buff a lot less. And it has a great synergy with precognition, which I again will get into later. As for stats in your items, I would make sure to roll crit chance and increased area damage. Outside of rolling crit chance on everything that can roll this stat, it is most beneficial to have all damage rolls once instead of stacking multiple instances to keep as many separate multipliers as possible. As for defensive stats, I would definitely prioritize damage reduction and then range damage reduction after that. You don't get a lot of melee hits, so having melee damage reduction is almost worthless. Lastly, having some health on hit and health on kill really helps you keep going. These stats rolls pretty frequently as extra stats on your relics once you have fused them to max. Keeping your health topped up from smaller hits throughout the map, or especially in the cathedral, saves you from unnecessary inoculator usage. And finally, The two variants of the build is simply switching out Aetherwalker armor from Warbound. Having set up your skill bars as shown earlier, you simply equip Aetherwalker armor when you're facing easy content, much like the weekly farm fest that we're facing currently. Once you start going into 250 plus missions or 4-player of any power level, you should switch to Warbound. This will allow you to run Precognition. The great interaction I referred to earlier between this relic specific enchant and Precognition is quite powerful. Precognition makes you gain Warp Heat when taking damage, and the enchant increases your damage reduction when gaining Warp Heat. Simply put, as long as you take continuous damage, your damage reduction will skyrocket and you will hit the damage reduction hard cap in no time. You can literally get run over by a Lehman Rust tank and stand back up with a little but a scratch. Do note that whenever you are hard CC'd, such as a knockdown or a full stun, all your buffs are gone. This build is practically worthless without buffs, so run to safety ASAP and get your buffs rolling before re-engaging. This sums up the entire guide. I do regret that it got this long, but on the other hand I have left out quite a lot of information. So if you have any questions, do feel free to contact me in-game. A huge shout out to the TOG guys, Compare, Phil, Bob and Deep Nausea. You can find links to their respective streams down below. This is only my version of the Psyker, and there's a lot more powerful Warp Heat builds out there, but this works decently in single player and truly shines once you get into the higher end 4-player missions, where this game is hopefully headed with its final endgame. I really hope that you guys found this useful, even with my poor voice production and really awkward voice. Thank you a lot for watching.